Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Birth of the Republic, 1763-89, 4th edition, by Edmund S. Morgan. Foreword by Joseph J. Ellis. Essay by Rosemarie Zagarri. Narrated by Lyle Blaker. Foreword to the 4th edition. Mark Twain once defined a classic as a book that everyone talks about, but no one actually reads. Edmund S. Morgan's The Birth of the Republic does not fit Twain's definition, since it has enjoyed several generations of American readers, to include a veritable legion of undergraduates who first encountered the American Revolution in its pages. But it is a classic in the traditional sense of the term, meaning that it provided a fresh interpretation of how and why that seminal event in American history happened. An interpretation that replaced the reigning wisdom of the previous 40 years. Originally published in 1956, The Birth of the Republic rested on research that Morgan had for his previous book, The Stamp Act Crisis. Based on exhaustive reading of the pamphlets, newspapers, and letters of the period, Morgan discovered a rather stunning agreement among American colonists in response to British attempts to reconfigure the empire after the French and Indian War. First, the Sugar Act, 1764, and then the Stamp Act, 1765, generated a united chorus of opposition based on the widespread presumption that Parliament lacked the authority to tax the colonists without their consent. Over the next 5 years, in response to British efforts to levy import duties for the purpose of raising revenue and to quarter troops in the colonies, the Americans reached the conclusion that Parliament lacked the authority to legislate for the colonies at all. If all this sounds rather obvious, shall we say self-evident, it is because Morgan's interpretation has succeeded so completely that it is difficult for us to imagine any plausible alternative. But for the first half of the 20th century, the dominant school of thought emphasized the deep class divisions within the American camp, described the constitutional arguments of the colonists as propagandistic rather than principled, and viewed the Constitution not as the fulfillment of Republican principles, but as a betrayal. On all these counts, Morgan challenged the established orthodoxy in order to recover the 19th century sense of the American Revolution as an unprecedented triumph for liberal political principles, albeit without the romantic haze and myth-making agenda of earlier historians like George Bancroft. It was and is a patriotic interpretation in the elemental sense that it depicts the American Revolution and the creation of a viable American nation-state in positive terms. Morgan was fully aware that the most transformative implications of the American Revolution were delayed or deferred. The rights of women were ignored, and, most worrisome, the obvious contradiction of slavery was finessed. He also recognized that the success of the movement for American independence was the death knell for Native Americans east of the Mississippi, next to slavery, our most egregious tragedy. Much of the scholarship over the last 30 years has focused on those groups, African Americans, women, Native Americans, that the American Revolution left behind, on occasion creating the impression that its failure to implement the full promise of its enlightened principles means the American Revolution was, in fact, a failure. The Birth of the Republic argues otherwise, depicting the late 18th century as the most creative era in American history, providing the ideas and institutions that would, over time, allow the United States to creep closer to its original ideals. Apart from its uplifting argument, part of the appeal of The Birth of the Republic is its prose style, which is blissfully bereft of academic jargon, sophisticated but simple in a way that scholarly specialists find impressive and ordinary listeners find comprehensible. Morgan makes the story he is telling take precedence over the note cards he has assembled. He regards narrative as the highest form of analysis, and he has a natural gift for telling a story, silently digesting mountains of historical evidence to produce the distilled essence of the issue at stake. He is fond of saying that when you construct a building, you put up scaffolding, but when the building is finished, you take the scaffolding down. He wears his learning lightly, in effect inviting us into a conversation about our origins as a people and a nation. The Birth of the Republic appeared on the early side of Morgan's long and prolific career, first at Brown, then for 31 years at Yale, from which he retired in 1986. Depending on how you count, he has authored or edited 26 books, ranging across the landscape of 17th and 18th century America. These include several works on New England Puritanism, a seminal study of race and class in early Virginia, biographies of John Winthrop, Ezra Stiles, George Washington, Roger Williams, and Benjamin Franklin, and a panoramic look at the concept of popular sovereignty in Anglo-American political thought. His work has received virtually every award the profession can bestow, capped off by the National Humanities Medal in 2000 and a special Pulitzer Prize for his lifetime achievement as a scholar. A persuasive case can be made that Morgan is the most respected American historian of the last half-century. This book, then, represents an early expression of the interpretive flair and stylistic skill that were destined to make an indelible mark on our understanding of America's origins. Here we can see him hitting his stride, revising the conventional wisdom of the causes and consequences of the American Revolution, synthesizing massive piles of scholarship succinctly, playfully tossing off a twinkling aside, making it all look so easy. This fourth edition includes revisions Morgan made in the text and the bibliographic essay in the second, 1977, and third, 1992, editions. October 2011. Joseph J. Ellis. Preface to the third edition. In the 15 years since the last revision, research on the Revolutionary period, except for some new studies of military history, has been directed primarily toward the social transformations that occurred in particular states and localities. Insofar as I have found my own understanding affected, I have made adjustments in the text and have also made some stylistic changes. But the basic theme of the book and my assessment of what the Revolution achieved remain much the same. November 1991. ESM. Preface to the second edition. In the 20 years since the first edition of this book appeared, historians studying the American Revolution have turned up so many new facts and suggested so many new interpretations of familiar facts that it seemed high time to make revisions and additions to this survey of the subject. The theme of the book remains as it was: the search by Americans of the Revolutionary period for principles on which they could take a common stand. The discovery of their willingness to coalesce around the principle of human equality still seems to me the most exciting thing about the Revolution. I hope that from the work of other scholars, as well as from my own continuing studies, I have achieved a richer understanding of how it happened. And I hope that the resulting changes in the text will enhance whatever contribution it may make to those who hear it. To that end, I have also added an appendix containing the basic documents in which the revolutionists embodied the ideas that brought them together. September 1976. ESM. Lexington Green. The men had been waiting since a little after midnight. Revere arrived about that time with his warning, and they tumbled out of bed and gathered on the common, where they shivered in the cold, clear April night for an hour or more. Now some had gone home, and the rest were in the tavern, waiting nervously as candles flickered lower for the roll of drums that would call them out again. No one was quite sure what they were supposed to do. No word had come from Concord or Boston to tell them. They must assemble. They must be ready. But for what? It was not suggested that they dispute the passage of the royal troops to Concord. No, they would simply stand there on the common, drawn up in military array, displaying by their formal presence the invincible dislike of Americans for what the British were up to. By the time the first streaks of dawn appeared, it began to seem that nothing was going to happen after all. It was several hours since Revere brought his message, and still no sign of the force he described. There must have been that tinge of disappointment we all feel despite our relief when some expected and exciting danger fails to materialize. Then Thaddeus Bowman was galloping up. They were coming. They were almost here. Grabbing of muskets, roll of drums, shouts of alarm, and Captain John Parker leads 70 men to the green in time to see the first columns of redcoats swing into view. There is no need for the British to cross the Green. The road to Concord runs along the left side of it, and Captain Parker has no intention of putting his men on that road. He will keep them on the Green, where they will be visible, perhaps audible, but out of the British line of march. Suddenly, a British officer in the uniform of a major of Marines is cantering across the grass, calling upon him and his men to disperse and lay down their arms. The regulars have broken into a run. They are pouring onto the Green, cheering wildly as they come. Parker, alarmed, gives the order to disperse, and the Americans, who have scarcely formed ranks yet, start to fall back, a few standing fast, refusing to budge. On both sides, the men are out of control, and before anyone knows what has happened, firing begins. Pitcairn, the major of Marines, signals frantically but vainly to stop it. The Americans, vastly outnumbered and already scattering, are driven from the field, leaving 8 dead and 10 wounded. The British officers, disgruntled and embarrassed, recover control, allow their men a formal cheer, and then hurry them on toward Concord. Thus inauspiciously began the war which produced the United States. One can scarcely imagine a more confused or futile gesture than that of the militiamen who stood on Lexington Green on that 19th of April in 1775. But we will make a bad mistake if we take their confusion to be a sign of irresolution or uncertainty, or even of mere foolishness. No war had begun when they hurried out of the tavern to take their places on the Green. They did not think they were rushing into battle, but simply into a posture of righteousness. Lexington, in fact, was not really a battle. It was a moment of transition between thought and action, between peace and war. For 11 years before it, Americans had been thinking and talking about their rights, issuing resolutions and petitions and declarations, enunciating the principles of government that they thought would preserve their freedom. The men who stood on Lexington Green stood there to testify to those principles. When they were attacked, they may have been surprised and momentarily confused, but they did not need to be told that the time had now come to fight. In the afternoon, when the troops came back from Concord, it was the Lexington men who attacked, along with the militia from other nearby towns, and the British who showed confusion as they fled in disorder toward Boston. The history of the American Revolution is in part the history of the years of action that followed after Lexington, but much more it is the history of the Americans' search for principles. That search brought them to Lexington and war in 1775, but it did not end there. Throughout the years of fighting, it continued and finally culminated in the adoption of the Federal Constitution. It was a noble search, a daring search, and by almost any standards, a successful search. This book describes some of the difficulties overcome, some of the dangers encountered, and some of the discoveries made in the course of it. 1. The Americans and the Empire. The people who undertook the search seemed to their contemporaries, and even to themselves, as unlikely a group as could be found to join in any common enterprise. The American colonists were reputed to be a quarrelsome, litigious, divisive lot, and historical evidence bears out this reputation. The records of the local courts in every colony are cluttered with such a host of small lawsuits that one receives from them the impression of a people who sued each other almost as regularly as they ate or slept. Their newspapers bristle with indignant letters to the editor about matters that now seem trifling. Ministers kept the presses busy with pamphlets denouncing each other's doctrines. Within every colony, there were quarrels between different sections. Eastern Connecticut despised Western Connecticut. Newport, Rhode Island was at odds with Providence, and the rest of New England looked upon the whole of Rhode Island with undisguised contempt. Western North Carolina was so irritated by Eastern North Carolina that civil war broke out in 1771. Not only did the different sections of every colony quarrel with each other, but every colony engaged in perennial boundary disputes with its neighbors. Even when faced with Indian uprisings, neighboring colonies could seldom be brought to assist each other. When New York was attacked, Massachusetts found that her budget would not allow her to send aid. When Massachusetts was attacked, the New Yorkers in turn twiddled their thumbs. So notorious was the hostility which every American seemed to feel for every other American that James Otis, one of the early leaders in the search we are about to examine, averred in 1765 that were these colonies left to themselves tomorrow, America would be a mere shambles of blood and confusion. And an English traveler who toured the colonies in 1759 and 1760 came to precisely the same conclusion. Were they left to themselves, there would soon be civil war from one end of the continent to the other. 20 years later, these same people united to create a government that has had a longer continuous existence than that of any other Western country except England. How they were able to do it must always remain a source of wonder, but with the benefit of hindsight, we may see that in spite of their divisions, they did have much in common. For one thing, they were mainly of English descent, and proud of it. There were two large exceptions. The first, a wedge of Scotch-Irish and Germans in the back country from Pennsylvania southward. The second, a 500,000 African slaves scattered throughout the colonies, but with the greatest numbers on the tobacco and rice plantations of the South. The Africans were the great exception to everything that can be said about colonial Americans. Though they did much of the work, they enjoyed few of the privileges and benefits of life in America. For the great majority of Americans who still spoke of England as home, even though they had never been there, being English meant having a history that stretched back continuously into a golden age of Anglo-Saxon purity and freedom. The past, as it existed in their minds, may have borne little resemblance to what actually happened. It was a past in which freedom, born among the Anglo-Saxons, was submerged by the Norman conquest, and only gradually recovered, the final triumph occurring in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It was more myth than reality, but the myth served to give the forester in New Hampshire and the cattle drover in North Carolina a pride in a common heritage. Even those parts of English history that had occurred since the founding of the colonies were cheerfully appropriated, and in the ensuing years of strife with the mother country, there was no repudiation of the heritage. Throughout the war and after, Americans maintained that they were preserving the true tradition of English history, a tradition that had been upset by forces of darkness and corruption in England itself. That such a defection should have occurred came as no surprise to the colonists, because they shared a distinctly bearish view of human nature. As they were for the most part English, so they were even more overwhelmingly Protestant. Maryland was the only colony with a substantial minority of Catholics, and except for a handful of German Lutherans, the Protestants were predominantly of Calvinist origin. Among the more sophisticated, especially in the cities and large towns, it was the fashion to take a somewhat happier view of human nature than Calvin had endorsed. But even those who thought man good enough to win heaven by his own efforts seem to have been skeptical about the likelihood of kings and statesmen making the grade. It was an outright infidel, Thomas Paine, who declared that the government, like dress, is the badge of lost innocence. This common assumption, that men, and especially men in power, are prone to corruption, was to prove a potent force in keeping Americans traveling together in the same direction. Still another common denominator lay in the fact that most of the inhabitants of every colony made their living from the soil. There were 4 or 5 large cities: Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, Newport, Boston, and several more good-sized towns where merchants and tradesmen flourished. But most people, north and south, lived on land they cultivated. And probably most of them, research has not revealed the exact proportion, especially in the north, owned their land. This widespread ownership of property is perhaps the most important single fact about the Americans of the Revolutionary period. It meant that they were not divided so widely between rich and poor as the people of the Old World. Most of the men and women who settled the colonies had come with expectations of a better life for themselves and their children, and most had achieved it. Though there was as yet no professed belief in social equality, though in every colony there were aristocrats, marked by the fine houses they lived in and the fine clothes they wore, there were no peasants for them to lord it over, except always the slaves. Apart from the slaves, the people were much of a piece, and did not know what it meant to bow and scrape to a titled nobility. Ownership of property gave not only economic independence but also political independence to the average American. In every colony that was to join in the Revolution, there was a representative assembly, elected by property holders, which made the laws and levied the taxes. Historians once assumed that the property qualification confined the suffrage to a small segment of the population, but if most men owned property, as now seems probable, then most men could vote. They enjoyed also a common privilege, the meaning of which was more difficult to determine. They were all subjects of Great Britain. This privilege, and they counted it as such, they shared not only with each other, but the people in Canada, Florida, the West Indies, and the East Indies. They were part of the largest empire the Western world had ever known, an empire that in 1763 had just finished defeating its most serious rival, France, in the long and bloody 7 Years' War. For Americans, the great thing about this empire, apart from the sheer pride of belonging to it, was that it let you alone. The average colonist might go through the year, might even go through a lifetime, without seeing an officer of the empire. The colonies had not been founded under imperial direction, but by private enterprise operating under what amounted to a license from the King of England. In most colonies, the king appointed the governor and gave him directions, but it was one thing to give directions and another to have them carried out. On paper, the governor's powers seemed large, larger even than those that the king enjoyed in the English government. The royal governor of a colony had the right to summon or dismiss his representative assembly at will, and he had a veto power over its every act. But in practice, the governor proved a paper tiger. He had virtually no funds to run the government, except what he could wheedle from the assembly. He could not do without the yearly taxes it voted, nor could he afford to antagonize the members who did the voting by disallowing legislation they favored. In practice, therefore, he could exercise his seeming powers only cautiously and sparingly. Otherwise, he might bring his government to a standstill. And though the king could still veto a colonial law that the governor had unwillingly allowed, the assemblies generally managed to get their way in the end. Their control over taxation was a weapon that even their distant monarch was obliged to respect. Apart from the royal governors, the only imperial officers normally encountered in the colonies were those charged with enforcing the Navigation Acts. These were acts passed by the British Parliament to regulate colonial trade, so that raw materials were produced for the mother country and manufactured goods were purchased there. The acts required that certain products of the colonies, such as tobacco, rice, indigo, and furs, when exported, should be taken only to England or to another English colony. They required that the colonies purchase European manufactures only through England, and they required that all colonial trade be carried in English or colonial shipping. The acts also charged duties to discourage the colonists from importing certain foreign items, granted bounties to encourage them in supplying specific raw products, and prohibited them from some kinds of manufacturing. For example, a bounty was granted on the production of raw iron, but the production of finished iron goods was forbidden, except in those mills already operating when the prohibition was established in 1750. The purpose of the acts was to promote the economic welfare of the empire in general, and of the mother country in particular. The restrictions placed on the colonies to make them serve English interests did not seriously hamper them, because the acts required the same kind of activities that the free play of economic forces would probably have produced anyhow. In America, natural resources, especially land, were cheap, while labor, and consequently manufacturing, was dear. In the Old World, the situation was reversed. Under these circumstances, it was advantageous for the colonists to sell raw materials and buy manufactures. Though they had to buy from England, England was the most advanced industrial country in the world, and could generally offer the best prices. The only navigation act that could have caused real hardship was one passed in 1733, placing a duty of 6 pence per gallon on molasses imported into the colonies from outside the British Empire. If it had been enforced, the Molasses Act might have crippled the New England rum trade and distilling industry. The duty on foreign molasses was prohibitively high, and the sugar plantations in the British West Indies, for the benefit of which the act was passed, did not produce enough molasses to satisfy the thirst of colonial tipplers or of the other rum drinkers from the fishing banks of Newfoundland to the coasts of Africa. But the act was not enforced. The customs officers who were supposed to collect the duty were a venal lot, and the New Englanders were able to arrange a standard bribe, varying from a halfpenny to a penny and a half per gallon, in return for which the officers looked the other way whenever a cargo of French molasses arrived. Doubtless the collectors were persuaded by similar methods to overlook occasional cargoes of French or Dutch textiles. But if the colonists felt aggrieved by the Navigation Acts, other than the Molasses Act, they did not say so. They did not even complain that the acts were passed by a British Parliament in which they had no representative. It has often been suggested that their contentment was the result of the ineffectiveness of imperial administration, and it must be admitted that the empire was run in a strangely listless manner. The government of Great Britain had not been designed to cover half the globe, and when Englishmen were not busy extending their possessions still farther, they were apt to regard the problem of turnpikes in Yorkshire as vastly more important than the enforcement of the Navigation Acts in New York. Administration of the colonies was left to the king, who turned it over to his Secretary of State for the Southern Department, whose principal business was England's relations with Southern Europe. The Secretary left it pretty much to the Board of Trade and Plantations, a sort of chamber of commerce with purely advisory powers. The Board of Trade told the Secretary what to do. He told the royal governors told the colonists, and the colonists did what they pleased. This system, or lack of system, had at least one virtue. It did no harm, a fact evidenced by the rolling prosperity of mother country and colonies alike. The British Empire, however inefficient in its management, was very much a going concern, and wise men on both sides of the Atlantic believed that its success was intimately connected with the bumbling way in which it was run. They saw both the prosperity and the inefficiency of the empire as results of the freedom that prevailed in it. Freedom, inefficiency, and prosperity are not infrequently found together, and it is seldom easy to distinguish between the first two. The British Empire was inefficient, but its inhabitants were prosperous, and they were free. It was this real and present freedom, even more than the long and honorable heritage of it, that the colonists cherished. They never tired of praising the government that made it possible, and in doing so they were by no means unique. The English, too, thought of freedom as the special virtue of their constitution, and the fashionable French philosophers agreed. The peculiarity of the English government responsible for this happy result was thought to be the combination of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy embodied in the King, House of Lords, and House of Commons. During the years since the first American colony was founded, the balance in the combination had altered. The effect of the Civil War of the 1640s and the Revolution of 1688 had been to reduce the authority of the king and to establish the predominance of Parliament, particularly the House of Commons. In the 18th century, it had come to be accepted that English liberty depended upon its predominance, and George III, the conscientious farmer who ascended the throne in 1760, never failed to acknowledge the supremacy of his Parliament. The colonists joined in the applause for Parliament. Though they had not participated directly in its past triumphs, they had enjoyed an analogous experience which they identified, in a way they might not have been able to define, with that of their English cousins. For while Parliament was winning control in England, the colonial assemblies were winning it overseas, and had tamed the royal governors almost as effectively as Parliament tamed the king. When Parliament got rid of James II in the Revolution of 1688, New England and New York threw off the new government James had.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?